Hey everyone, before we begin the video, I just want to talk about my critique. This isn't the best critique I've put out, even though I really did want this video to be one of the best ones. Typically when I make critique videos, I always do my best to put the best quality content I could provide you guys, but these past 2 months have been rough on me, simply because I ended up catching COVID, and then second of all, the PC I normally work on just decided to quit on me, and I had to there's just long story short, I did my best to recover the PC and repair it, but it came to a point it was just best for me to replace it, but luckily I was able to recover the work I had on it, the files, you know, the videos and such that I had planned and to upload. So we're slowly gonna roll those out in the future, and also like a lot of like my Spider-Man footage was on my old PC, so we were able to recover that. I also mainly want to say that the quality of this critique isn't the best, and it's because of my commentary. My commentary may sound weird, or the way I pronounce some things, it's gonna sound like I'm gasping for air, and that's really because I am trying to. And I know a lot of people are saying like what about your health, dude? Honestly, I'm fine. The fact that I was able to create this video, I'm totally fine. It's just I'm still recovering from COVID, and every time, I don't know if this is COVID related, but every time I'm trying to talk, I have a difficult time breathing. So I hope everyone could be patient on me in this video if I do sound weird and all that. And I know some people are saying maybe you should have put this out later in the future, but I feel like with how YouTube is and how things are with the state of content creation, if you kind of upload things late, things kind of become irrelevant. But it's also how other things to cover in the future for this channel. So I do want to put this out ASAP, especially how like I initially started this video project back in November. I wrote the script in November, and I did take a break in December because of other things I was going through. I was supposed to start the project, or like continue the project, by the end of December and upload it by beginning of January, but that never happened. So anyway, I hope you guys understand and hope you enjoyed the video. This is my passion, this is my love. So regardless of like the issues that I was going through, I enjoyed creating this video. I want you guys to know that. And I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I promise you guys in the future you'll see better content from me as soon as I get things together and up and running again. Man, just being absent for like basically like 2 months have been wild, and I was kind of losing it. Remember, drop a like and subscribe, and if you're new, I hope you check out my other critiques and enjoy them as well. Roll the intro, baby. Spider-Man has always been an important figure in my life growing up. Spider-Man is just those characters that give hope to someone and is an inspiration to many young kids, including myself, who share the same values as him. I know I haven't discussed much about Spider-Man on this channel, and it's really that I never had an opportunity like this to express much more of my childhood, since things have been so fast-paced on covering many games here. During my childhood, there were certain characters that always remained to my mind, my memories and heart. Spider-Man was one of them. I loved every iteration of Spider-Man. It's hard for me to not show any sort of interest because I always found every Spider-Man unique to itself. Although you could give valid criticisms about certain Spider-Man or Spider-Women, there's usually a heart you could feel in these comics, films, games, or shows. If not, I believe it's the unfamiliarity of the team not representing the characters and their values. Now, Marvel's Spider-Man 2 has been one of those games that many people have anticipated for. With the first game released released in 2018 at that time, that was one of the best iterations I have seen for Spider-Man, especially for gaming. You have to understand that there weren't the greatest superhero games out there, and still is, not gonna lie. And usually a lot of superhero games struggle with immersion or representing the character and what it can be for a video game. So when Marvel's Spider-Man released in 2018, everything about Spider-Man was present for its gameplay and story. I loved a lot of the content and of course the web sling that Insomniac built for that game. They really hit the nail on what Spider-Man was to me, and the immersion in combat and traversal was unreal to experience. To only follow up with more content, a polished version of the first game, which was a standalone story of Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales. With a little change in its gameplay, I wouldn't necessarily say people had higher expectations of the upcoming Spider-Man 2, but with how the gameplay was presented in Miles Morales, there was an expectation of having much more of a refined experience in Spider-Man 2. The game surprisingly shows equally both sides of the Spider-Man. I didn't really have a hunch where one character was being left out. I actually felt that the main cast of characters, which is Harry, Peter, Miles, and MJ, had some sort of development throughout the game. Yeah, some characters may seem to have better arcs than some, but the main focus is Peter and Miles for their stories. What I did enjoy seeing throughout the story is Peter losing his sense of responsibility due to many obstacles he is dealing with in his personal life, while Miles has an upbringing of his own, or having the sense of becoming responsible, not just as Spider-Man, but as Miles Morales. The story of these two is not repetitive to experience to say the least, but it brings a yin-yang theme for Miles and Peter. We experience two different perspectives of these characters, and during my first playthrough, there are times where I preferred a Spider-Man over the other. There may be an audience, maybe even yourself, where you wouldn't like seeing a character being thrown for another character's development, but that's not the case at all. In these scenarios, what made me appreciate these characters a lot more is that there's a gray area to them, even though they are superheroes with all these fancy technology, utility, and with crazy physical strength. Their mistakes are just like anyone else in this world, and that's what makes Spider-Man a lovable human. They are not perfect, and they are just like us. I personally think that this game is actually a bit darker than the first game, which is why I believe some people disagree with how Peter's direction went for the story. You experience firsthand of his struggles and him not necessarily being the Spider-Man he and everyone expected himself to be, which is the beauty of it all. The reason why I feel this game is a bit darker than the first is that there's just much more consistency of consequences or the feeling of things being on the line. I personally felt that Spider-Man 2018 had a lot of typical superhero moments you would see coming from these films or shows involving any hero. It's not a bad thing that it has these traits, and I came into Spider-Man 2 not living up to the expectations of its first game. I truly believe that Spider-Man 2018 really solidified what Spider-Man should have been for recent Spider-Man media. I really enjoyed the pacing of the story, its characters, and overall how things were presented. I believe that this was a game that anyone can get into and should be into if they had some sort of interest in Spider-Man. It could have been its own film if it wanted to become one. That's how confident I felt about the first game being amazing. So coming into Spider-Man 2, I was surprised it held its own with not just the gameplay but the story itself. What makes this unique compared to the first is that it really feels like a comic book storyline, along with its pacing. There are a lot of things that branch to different directions within the story. You see many characters, and the world generally feels a bit more alive with different interactions you go throughout the game. I can see this being a problem to some people, considering if you digest video game storylines like a movie, things will mentally feel overwhelming or would seem odd to you of how things are executed. I personally think with how this comic book like structure is for the game, it naturally flows right, even though I still thought there were moments the pacing was a bit off or oddly placed in certain parts. The only problem I had with the game is how the main story and side quests can feel not as immersive at times. There are significant parts in the story, like when Peter obtains the symbiote suit, his personality starts to change over time, especially during main story events. Insomniac even put in more detail to his character's behavior during the gameplay while you are free roaming in New York. As you're about to fight the random generated crimes, Symbiote Peter starts to have dialogue that is more aggressive or hostile as he speaks towards the enemies.
So they want to play with fire, huh? Arrest! Is that him? You think this is fun? It's about us. Guess they couldn't handle the heat.
I wanted to see much more of it, especially when initiating side quests. I generally felt it would have been a nice touch to see Peter react to different things when the symbiote is a part of him, since there's quite a decent gap of free time during those segments. So with side quests in this game, They have much more quality and story into them. There is incentive to experience the side content, and there was a point where you did a quest line with Yuri, who is now the Wraith. She didn't even bother to comment or question what is going on with Peter with his new symbiote suit. It was strange to see, considering how she was close up with the symbiote suit. Just did not look right at all to the average person when the suit looked very slimy and had a weird form to it. The game lacks this type of immersion for its story. Also, how Peter's behavior was completely back to normal, as if the symbiote was never a part of him. Another thing similar to this is how the main story and side quests don't reflect well during certain points of the game. I found myself being very selective on what side content I should do. Since major things in the main story happen, it would feel awkward to see Spider-Man casually doing the typical friendly neighborhood activities, so I held out on certain quests until it was the right time to do so. I felt they should have decided to either lock out certain side quests until you complete Pacific main story quest, or create a whole other scenario to keep the open world feel. I do understand that if they were to create variables of scenarios of where the player is at, I'm pretty sure development's time would have been much longer. I was surprised that they sort of made slightly different scenarios for side quests depending which Spider-Man you were, and I thought that was a really nice touch because it was something I didn't expect, since these Spider-Man games are very linear. What I am about to mention is something I've mentioned multiple times in the past, especially if they are focused on creating stories and immersion for the players in these big AAA games. Seeing how Spider-Man 2 put in the work with the amount of detail in these quests wherever you participated in, I would love to see them develop things similar to how CD Projekt's quest design is. For those who are not familiar with their games such as Cyberpunk or The Witcher, they create these open world games that have a lot of branching stories or quests depending on what decisions you make or what part of the story you are in. Their games feel immersive due to that and how the player feels the continuity of their character's actions. I really wanted to see more detail, surprisingly, since I'm the guy who wants to have prioritized gameplay nowadays, but seeing the level of detail in Spider-Man 2, it could have been pushed more. Like what I mentioned earlier is that they even went through lengths to give slightly different variations of the Spider-Man for their side content, so it would have been greater to see the world react to how these characters are in the certain conditions they are in. Now, I'm pretty sure a lot of people wonder how I feel about Venom's appearance, since he was the big bad for this game during its promotion pre-release. The way they created Venom and showcased him in this game was nearly perfect. He pretty much took over as soon as he arrived. The end of Act 2 was already in the palm of his hands, and I thought the way they plotted his literal takeover was dark. It's what I mean where there was actual threat in the storyline. Of course, the best thing Insomniac Games did with Venom was making him playable as soon as he is shown. Not only was the gameplay chaotic when he was first introduced, but it works well for how they did his story segment. The gameplay itself when playing as Venom was already descriptive enough to tell how much this character can have an impact on the final act. I did read a few comments somewhere online where they believe that Venom should have been in the game longer, but I don't know how they would have written Venom as great as what they did for the end of Act 2 and the whole entirety of Act 3. If they decided to keep him throughout the game, I feel his appearance wouldn't be as grand as it was with this game. I do think they should have done more with adding newer side stories during Act 3 and showing how cruel the state of New York is currently in, since Act 3 you kind of zoomed through it despite how much detail they did to it. They literally rearranged, changing up how the map is, but for the main plot I thought things were great. I do want to mention Kraven. He was also one of the main villains for Spider-Man 2. Before the game was released and we only had context with certain information and trailers from the developers, it was shown 5 months before the game launched that Kraven will be one of the villains for the game. That puts everyone, along with myself, questioning how they will implement these two characters in one game. Now, I don't know much of Kraven, nor wasn't interested in this villain to begin with, and putting him with Venom made me not as worried, but I question how Insomniac will write their villains up. They clearly don't struggle putting many characters on screen or in the game, just like how it was with Spider-Man 2018 with the Sinister Six and other villains that fit the grounded Spider-Man stories. It's just that with Kraven and Venom, how I perceive them is that they are standalone villains that can have substance in their individual stories. I was a bit worried if one or the other will have a setback or have less focus on the characters due to there being two big villains for this story, which my instinct was a bit right on that. Again, I was never a big fan of Kraven, but how he is shown in this story, I wasn't really intrigued either where things went until we had Venom. I wanted Kraven to be a bigger threat than what he initially was for this game, and I'm quite aware that he took out several villains, but it was off screen. He also didn't show much mercy to others as well, which showed his villain side and led to great moments, but I felt things needed to have more depth to his character that is shown on screen. Funny enough, you kind of appreciate his character later on in the game because you start finding documents or side quests that relate to him, and you eventually have more background information. I also think he should have been the biggest threat for any of the Spider-Men, especially for Peter Parker, where Peter's motivations, his beliefs, his character is much more challenged from both of the main villains of the game, especially how the symbiote is one of the main challenges Peter faces. I think this would have been the perfect opportunity to really showcase Peter's struggles of how difficult it is to have this sort of life that he still manages to keep. Instead, Kraven more so targets villains and Spider-Man is just an obstacle for him. After all this being said, I'm still satisfied with what I got for this game, and I would say that I'm quite satisfied with how the story went as well. I mentioned earlier that the story pacing and how things are structured are quite like how it is in the comics, which works well for a video game. How I feel on seeing so many different characters, and even if they didn't have much screen time or involvement with any of the main stories or side stories, the world generally feels alive and how natural characters can just shift into these Spider-Man stories. I mean, even the reveal of Carnage being teased for a later story during Yuri's questline was surprising and amazing to see. It just makes me even more excited about what Insomniac will have in store for us in the future. I would say the experience you go through for Spider-Man 2, I believe, is on par with the first game in terms of its story. I was amazed how the graphics and performance went. Clearly Spider-Man didn't go a hyper-realistic route with its art style, but it was outstanding with how the game looked and performed. What's most important about all of this was the wide selection of graphic presets you can do. Well, only if you had the 120Hz option, of course. With the inclusion of 120Hz, I was able to play the game on max settings, that is able to run it on 40 to 60 FPS by playing it in fidelity mode, while the VRR settings are on uncapped. What is amazing about VRR settings, and that is combined with the graphics modes of performance and fidelity, is that you have much more control on how you want your game to run. When you have the smooth option for the VRR settings, it will maintain resolution and target a steady frame rate, while uncapped will allow lower resolutions to target higher, more variable frame rates. Although both look like they have heavy sacrifices for visuals, they really don't if you put the game on fidelity. That is the workaround to have max settings, or more so have an optimal version for having best of both worlds, performance and frame rate. Fidelity mode is to have better resolution and image quality with all ray tracing options on, while the uncapped VRR settings is to let it breathe with more frame rate instead of being capped to 30. I'm not like Digital Foundry where I could give all the details. They made a few videos discussing how the combinations of settings run. What I've described hopefully can give you an understanding how Insomniac created a graphic settings that a lot of developers should have worked on and utilized more of the 120Hz options in their games. I think it's important to give players how they want the game to run, since everyone has a different eye when it comes to video game visuals. An example I could give is the latest release of Final Fantasy XVI, where the game had performance and visual issues in both graphic modes, which created a discussion on what mode is better. A lot of people preferred to set the game on fidelity mode since it locked on a stable frame rate with better resolution, while performance mode was stuttery to some and had dips in resolution. I tried both of the game modes in my first playthrough, but I honestly prefer the performance mode since I didn't really see much stuttering in frame rate, and it's also how this game is fast paced in combat, so it worked well to my eyes. A lot of games that focus on 30 FPS and put a bunch of filters that are just unnecessary for the game tend to give me a headache after playing a certain period of time. It's unfortunate with certain games I have enjoyed because its visuals tend to make me avoid it instead of looking forward to playing it more. I'm not really gonna go deeper into this topic, but this graphics discussion with playing the game on one graphics preset is horrible to say the least. I was actually very happy to see the selection of what you could turn off for on-screen visuals when playing Spider-Man 2. They gave options to turn off motion blur, film grain, chromatic aberration, and depth of field with some fun visuals that you can use as well, which is Into the Spider-Verse animations and comic effects. The main options that were really important to me were the motion blur and chromatic aberration, which can really change how the game visually looks and feels. Chromatic aberration just creates a weird filter I don't enjoy seeing, while it sort of blurs the resolution, but motion blur is probably one of the screen effects that actually cause my headaches when playing certain games. I am quite aware that motion blur is good on lower frame rate games that run 30 FPS, but what I've brought up before, my head just can't manage games with motion blur. I think motion blur has to be done right, because games back then that ran on the PS4 and 30 FPS were fine to me, like the Final Fantasy VII Remake and Spider-Man 2018. Usually motion blur just seems like it's slapped on the game rather than being carefully utilized for certain segments, and I do hope with future games being developed, we could have some options that can avoid bad graphics presets. Big props to the dev team for Spider-Man 2. I did expect them to have options for graphics presets, but with how deep the graphics settings are, I was very satisfied with how much control I had. It was almost as if I was managing graphics settings on a PC. I can't emphasize how important this topic is with gaming, especially how we have the tech to manage them now. With this next segment discussing gameplay, I haven't tried all the accessibility options and a few in-game modifiers that were offered in the settings. My apologies for those who want to be informed about it. There were a lot of settings I normally do not use in these games, and so I will not be going deep into the discussion with these settings since I'm not the right person to necessarily talk about it. I did use in-game modifiers, which can sort of change up how you approach the game. I think this was a nice addition to have since everyone has a different perspective on game difficulty and design. The gameplay settings offer challenge level modifiers that use the difficulty presets, and an example is that you could play spectacular mode, which is the hardest difficulty on your first playthrough, and you are able to make enemy damage to normal instead of the difficulty being capped to spectacular mode if you feel that the enemies do too much damage or have a lot of health. There are other options like simplified puzzles, which create less challenge and you could quickly go through the puzzles that are in the game. I believe this is useful if you could care less about these things. The others pretty much give assistance in different ways. They're auto aiming, you could change the game speed and have the chase assist on. I never really bothered to use the gameplay modifiers simply because I thought my gameplay experience was fine. If you do have any sort of experience with utilizing these settings, feel free to comment, because I am quite curious how these settings can give a better quality involvement to the player. The settings I really use were the swing assist options. On default, they basically give you a safe setting where you could have fun swing without taking any sacrifice or punishment. In the beginning of my playthrough after the tutorial level, I ended up turning off the swing steering assistance, which gave Spider-Man more of a realistic web swing. You would have to be more calculated on your swings, and what I mean by that is physics is more involved when it is off, but you have much freedom on how you swing. My initial impressions when I had it off is that I didn't really notice the difference until later on in certain gameplay segments where I kept landing on the ground and I had a hard time chasing people when web swinging. Eventually I did get used to it, and I appreciate the web swinging here more than in the first game since it adds a layer of difficulty, which I believe these types of games need. Another setting I had was fall damage. I believe that this setting is not properly implemented. I barely took fall damage throughout my whole first playthrough, and there were plenty of times where I thought I would die because I messed up on a swing. The only times you take fall damage are in the most obvious scenarios where if you jump off a building and land on your feet without using your webs, you will take up a lot of damage or fall to your death. Other than that, as long as you're swinging, you're not going to see it often unless you have a difficult time traversing around the place. I also noticed there are some exploits to avoid fall damage easily, which makes this setting a bit useless. But again, it's simply an option you could have off or on. To me, what was important is the tactical side for web swinging, but I do hope these features can be improved much more for the next game. I enjoy the formula of how Insomniac made Spider-Man, and these games get fun when there's much more difficulty involved. On my first playthrough playing on spectacular difficulty, I was very surprised that the mode was giving me a rough time at some points in the game. It really made me push their combat mechanics much more and create engagement for me than simply running through the entire playthrough. The problems I had with the first game is when replaying it, it really felt like a beat 'em up game, which is fine for superhero games. I believe they are appropriate since they give you the power fantasy feel, but with the games that have great gameplay implemented to them, I feel it is a waste when games tend to be easy. The mechanics created and how levels are designed, people can just blast through them with no thought. Spider-Man 2018 is just those games that deserves the player's attention to push their mechanics to the limit when playing on a higher difficulty. With Spider-Man 2, it's safe to say that Insomniac didn't hold back on creating harder difficulties. I actually felt I put more thought into approaching boss fights and regular mob fights. I felt the mob fights later on in the game during Act 3, or maybe even before then, can give you a tougher time with crowd control. There are certain things that created the gameplay to be difficult with what Spider-Man does. They nerfed his perfect dodge, which I believe it was completely OP in the first game, which made the core gameplay easy, but it was also the lack of equipment the Spider-Man had. There were a lot of gadgets in the first game which gave so many options to approach combat, but here in Spider-Man 2 they decided to limit the equipment, shortcut them as abilities, and they sort of combined a few gadgets that were placed in 4 gadget movesets to use. This may be a problem to some people since the tools are taken away from us, not only in combat, but in stealth as well. Stealth is much more bare bones since before you were able to use gadgets during stealth gameplay, but now it's you just doing silent takedowns. Although they added a webline ability for you to traverse easily when doing stealth segments as the Spider-Man, it doesn't change how the stealth levels are. I actually found myself having a difficult time doing stealth correctly, or if the level design isn't the same with the previous games. I actually enjoyed doing stealth in Miles Morales and Spider-Man 2018, even though it was very simple to do. So coming in Spider-Man 2, I had higher expectations of them implementing stealth better than the other 2 games. Instead, it's sort of a step down due to their gameplay balancing. With how things are in combat balance for Spider-Man 2, it's a bittersweet feeling since they overdid it with gadgets in the first game, but it helped create a sandbox-like gameplay for the combat. It's just that it was overpowered to be using all of them at the same time. Spider-Man 2 limits them and adds cooldowns in order to make the player to be a bit more tactical and have more challenges on the field. As much as I dislike how stealth was handled, the combat in intense fights feel better than ever before, which enables the pressure for players to encounter. It is appropriate to focus on the fast-paced combat than stealth, since even with the first, the core gameplay was always hand-to-hand combat, which they did add new additions for the Spider-Men along with their enemies. The Spider-Men are able to block, and if you are able to time the block right before they hit you, you can do a parry that creates an opening for a follow-up attack. Although this is a nice addition, I only found the parry to be nice against bosses or a few enemies. They added new mechanics to enemies where you are able to only dodge or parry, which tends to be confusing during middle of the fight since the indicators look nearly the same. Psychologically, I always tend to dodge since that's what you usually do a lot throughout the game compared to the parries. So I had a rough time adjusting my playstyle from time to time, and I definitely thought they would have approached the defensive mechanics much better. The main issue I do have with the combat is that there's no big difference compared to the first game. They never really bothered to amp up the variety of movesets. When the tutorial came in the first hour, they introduced the 4 set of physical abilities you could use along with the gadgets, so the Spider-Man arms were one of the first things you use. I thought initially they were going to provide us with a variety of movesets utilizing the Spider Arms combat. Every action game in their sequels tend to do this. Instead, just like the other things for combat in this game, it is restricted. What you experienced in Spider-Man 2018 did not change a lot. There are more so just add-ons to the combat that make the experience slightly better or convenient to how it is designed for Spider-Man 2. Although I believe the saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it, I was a bit disappointed with how the combat was basically untouched. Even the skill trees for both Spider-Man seemed redundant since there were some skills that were alike. Again, it was just a bit irritating at that moment when you find out the gameplay doesn't evolve as what you wanted it to be, especially how you see action games like Devil May Cry go beyond the combat's creativity. I still think the gameplay is fine for what it is. It's just the afterthought of knowing it could have been better if they bothered to push the boundaries for the combat. The biggest positive I have for gameplay is the quality they had for web swinging. I generally feel they have perfected to the sense where most players do not want to utilize the fast travel because of how satisfying it feels and to see those gorgeous animations when web swinging. I was pretty content with how Spider-Man 2018 had done their web swing mechanic. I know some people had a problem with it, but I did expect that mechanic to improve upon in a later entry or entries. Literally the next game after Spider-Man 2018, Miles Morales' standalone game was a success with how they approached it. Things felt faster paced, snappy, and fluid as Miles web slings through the city. Now, I never expect Spider-Man 2 to really improve upon that because, in all honesty, what can you really do? Somehow Insomniac added little minor abilities that gave an enhancement from what we had in Miles Morales. They added sharper swings to turn these corners correctly. You could literally slingshot yourself anywhere in the city to give a big startup boost before web swing, and even added web wings to glide. To only complement this whole mechanic with the momentum you can gain from doing all these web swing tricks. With the PS5's technology, Insomniac was able to utilize the hardware correctly in order to really give the players the real feeling of Spider-Man when zipping through New York. Gaining momentum while web swing is honestly one of the best satisfactions you could have when playing. Another nice detail to the web swing is how different the Spider-Man feel when you control them. It's honestly hard to describe the difference, but once playing, you could tell that each Spider-Man has their own unique style for web swing, which I admire Insomniac for. If they were to give much focus on any mechanic for this game, as much as I wanted to see different things for combat, at least their focus was on its web swinging, which is the identity and the core element of Spider-Man. I am happy that the focus was on that. You could tell that the team was putting in much work and improvement throughout the years to get this right. Not a lot of games have expression and convenience with their traversal system. Spider-Man 2 is unique because you as the player are able to use the traversal system as gameplay mechanics. Web swing is an all-around feature that is pushed in nearly every scenario of the game. It wants you to feel free and utilize Spidey's webs to your advantage. It creates engagement to lock in players to be better on their movement, especially when you are in big open areas of New York. At the same time, it creates a wonderful experience for the player to naturally roam around or get to where they need to be. I believe the overall experience for Spider-Man 2 is one of the best polished mechanics we have out of all the Insomniac Spider-Man games. They managed to put quality in every aspect they have done for this game, to branching storylines that could lead to who knows what, and alongside good fan service. Insomniac Games still was able to put their heart, their love, their soul into this game, and you could see it. For those who watch my previous critiques, I always mention that AAA games tend to struggle or forget the medium they really are in this gaming space. Not a lot of big games I see really focus on them actually being video games. More so, it seems that there is less priority on being a game with gameplay mechanics, which is why it's still surprising to see some games that could push AAA standards but maintain what video games are. I know that is such a broad statement since video games can be many things, but the reality of what games were is slowly disappearing because of the focus on cinematic stories. I believe you could still do whatever you want to a game, whether it is telling a story or creating a whole different experience for gaming, but I think it's important to remember that the game is a game. People look forward to learning gameplay mechanics to experience great gameplay and replay them once more. Replay value in games are not often discussed or included in. As someone who loves to replay their games, especially if I see great gameplay mechanics in them, it's a bit disappointing replaying the game because of how much story is implemented in that particular game, which drags the whole gameplay experience since it was designed as if it was a one-time playthrough. Although Spider-Man 2 does not include New Game Plus as of now of this recording, which will be included in a future update, the game does unlock Ultimate Mode after your first playthrough, which gives incentive to do another fresh run with pushing its gameplay mechanics even more for the player. What's important for Spider-Man 2 is that the team managed to create a game that can cater to everyone on what they look forward to in video games. It has a nice balance for story and gameplay that intertwine well with each other alongside settings that can benefit your gameplay experience. I know, I had some differences with how this game was formatted, but I truly hold on to this belief that this is one of those rare AAA games from a team that knows what games are truly about in this day and age. This is my critique on Marvel's Spider-Man 2 created by Insomniac Games, and Yuzora Dreams is out. Thank you for watching. Peace.